It's a great privilege to welcome Kenneth here today, who's a professor of sociology at Stockholm University, and he works in the Swedish Institute of Social Research, otherwise known as SoFI, as women's name, perhaps, and he heads the social policy unit. What's also new is that he's giving them up after having been there for a long time and is going to Oxford to be a professor in the Oxford Social Policy Department from next year. It's close at hand. Congratulations to him. So Kenneth does a lot. He's co-chair of Espenet. He's on the board of Fizz, which is not a sort of soft drink. It's the Federation for International Social Security. He chairs the Nordic Sociological Association, and so on and so on. He does lots in social policy, well-being, and so on. Look at his webpage. He's got lots of projects, lots of publications, and amongst the areas in which he's working on is the topic of today: social sustainability and decarbonised welfare state. And it's also going to draw another of his projects. Kenneth is a progenitor of the SPIN database, which I think you'll tell us about as we go along, which is essentially bringing together lots of information to describe welfare states in one place that we could all use. Anyway, Kenneth, over to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's the first time at LSE, actually. So I'm very excited. So I will essentially present this study, which I remember when you asked me if I could have a presentation here. I didn't really know what to present because I didn't have a paper. I didn't even have any data, so I was very, very unsure that I would have anything to present. But finally, I had some time, and I actually were able to do this paper. Oh yeah. But before I go into the paper, I just wanted to give some background to sort of why I do this or why we do this. So basically, goes back a few years in time, when we launched a very big research infrastructure program in Sweden. It's a collaboration between the major universities in Lund, Uppsala, Stockholm, and so forth. And there's basically a shitload of money that the Swedish Research Council are currently investing. And the idea is to bring together all different projects in Sweden that have collected data on policy, on democracy, environment, conflict, and migration, and so forth, to a single sort of a single space where people can download this thing. So in that big research infrastructure, I'm heading the module on policy. And what we do there is that I unite forces with some of my colleagues. So we will have 3 areas of policy that we focus on, which we collect data on. That's social policy, of course, where the SPIN data that also direct comes in. But then there is migration policy, and then also environmental policy. And the reason we do this is not only because we want to serve the research community with data, it also because we have a real interest in this, and we really think that these policy areas are interlinked. And particularly what we're interested in at the moment is that the consequences of the environmental policy, if those consequences somehow could be modified by the ways in which we have organized the welfare state. So based on this data, we then also applied for some money to actually do some research. So first, we received a project grant to study the distributive consequences of environmental policy. And the idea then is that we're interested in to know whether the welfare state somehow or able to modify those distributive consequences, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But we're also interested in the political consequences of environmental policy, and if the political support towards environmental policy can be strengthened by a big general welfare state. And I think this year we received another grant where we were supposed to study attitudes. So essentially what we try to do is that we want to analyze environmental policy, which will have distributive outcomes, which in turn will affect people's opinions, preferences, and stuff like that, which in turn will have an effect, political effects on governments. So that's what we try to do. Essentially, we just started. So this paper is that I will present today. It's basically the only thing we have. But we have hired a PhD student in sociology. We do a PhD thesis about distributed consequences, and then we have hired a PhD in political science as well. We do a thesis about the political consequences of environment. That's sort of a little bit of a short background. If you want me to clarify anything, so you can just raise your hands. So the basic idea with at least this paper is that we believe that climate change see how they're formulated. Yeah, many of the environmental challenges not only poses a threat to ecological sustainability, but we also think that they create a threat for social sustainability. And the reason is quite simple. It is because environmental policies typically have distributed consequences, and particularly in the area of environmental taxes, which I will talk about. So without an ambitious redistributive agenda through the welfare state, those threats could be quite severe. And it could even sort of reduce people's willingness to scale up decarbonization efforts and so on. So that's the reason why we think this is important. So this idea that environmental policy and social policy somehow is linked is not at all new. There's been research on this for over 2 decades, and I know that Ian Goff, who I think is still affiliated at least with LSE, I'm not sure if he's fully retired, have written extensively about it. And at most social policy conferences, there are usually 1 or 2 panels on environmental policy. But when you start to look at that literature, which is very interesting, you also quite soon discover that it's fairly abstract and it's very theoretical, and there is hardly any empirical quantitative on these connections. So this is where we want to make a contribution. So the contribution that we want to make is not really that theoretical, but it's more empirical. We want to study it, see if it's possible to observe these links between social and environmental policy who have hard data. So the purpose simply of this paper is to analyze if the welfare state acts as a buffer against potential adverse distributive outcomes of taxes imposed on household consumption for various environmental purposes. So in the paper, we basically have 2 hypotheses that we've tried to test. The first one is pretty simple. In this case, we look at social insurance, and we look at the degree of income replacement of social insurance. And this is from the SPIN data that we have worked on for a number of years. It's the same data. It was not called SPIN back then, but it's essentially the same data that Esping used in its 3 words. Then the question, why do we look at income replacement in social insurance? Well, there, of course, there are many different areas of the welfare state, which obviously could have an effect on the distributive consequences of environmental taxes. But we know from previous studies that we have done, both myself and my colleagues, that the degree of income replacement in social insurance have proven previously to be associated both with inequality, poverty, health, and a bunch of other items. So if there is anything, if we look at one indicator in the welfare state to test our ideas, we think that the degree of income replacement in social insurance is pretty good first alternative. So the first hypothesis is pretty simple. It's basically high degrees of income replacement in social insurance should reduce the probability of being relatively income poor because of an environment. But we also know from previous literature, and this is something that you all know, is that the risks of poverty are not distributed equally in society. Some groups carry much higher poverty risks than other groups. And one such group that quite often are singled out as having high poverty risks are people with lower education. So there is sort of a social gradient in risks of poverty. So here we believe as well then that the degree of income replacement in social insurance will not only reduce the probability of being poor because of environmental taxes, but also would reduce potential social gradients that may be linked to education. So that's typically, or basically, the two hypotheses that we want to empirically test in this very short bit. As I said, we use the social policy indicators database. It consists of different modules. So there is one module on the major social insurance schemes, like unemployment, sickness, pensions, accident insurance. That's the module that has been used in the 3 words. But over the years, we have added new modules of data to the scheme database. We have one module on parental leave benefits, one module on child benefits. We have one module, special module on out of work benefits. We have one on social assistance and support. So it's constantly growing source of information about social. And in this paper, we use the data from the SPIN project at the country level, and then we also use data from EUSIL, so microdata, individual outcomes. We use a logistic regression, and I actually already want to tell you about what we find. And obviously, we find support to our hypothesis. So the degree of income replacement in social insurance seems to be of importance for the probability of people ending up in poverty due to paying environmental taxes. So it seems to be the case that higher income replacement in social insurance reduces that probability, but also reduces the probability of being poor due to environmental taxes, which is linked to poor education. So I will show you that in just a minute. But before I do that, we have this problem. So we wanted to analyze the distributed outcomes of environmental taxes. The problem was that there is no data available where we can actually analyze how these taxes are distributed in society. So we had to invent that somehow. And the idea that we had was that we would originally we did not think about EUSIL. but we rather thought about the European Household Budget Service. I don't know if you know about this, but they're basically national surveys that have been launched in a number of European countries, where people are asked about their expenditures in like 300 different cost categories. So the idea was that we would feed environmental information about environmental taxes into these household budget surveys, and then run all the analysis on that. But it soon turned out quite difficult, because in the end, when we want to do the empirical analysis, we are not only interested in the educational attainment of the respondents, but also a bunch of other factors that we need to control for. The problem with the household budget surveys is it turned out that there were always some missing information for the different countries. So if we had to exclude countries with missing information on at least one of the variables we were interested in, we just ended up with 3 or 4 countries left out. So we couldn't use the household budget survey if we wanted to run state-of-the-art statistical regression. So then we thought that, okay, so maybe we can use EU-SILT. And then I read a fancy paper from Eurostat where they imputed some data from the household budget surveys into EU-SILT. So I thought, okay, that's quite fascinating. So let's try that. So basically, this is one reason why I was not sure whether we will have something to present today, because I wasn't finished with this imputation. If the imputation were not successful, it would not be okay. So the imputation of data from HBS into Euromod were based then on two stages. The first stage was to get environmental tax data into HBS, and then from HBS impute tax data into EU-SILT. The first stage is fairly simple and straightforward. So here we basically used Eurostat tax revenue statistics. So for every European country, they have information on how much tax revenue do the government get from environmental taxes, both at a household level, which are paid by households when they consume it, or which are paid by the industry. And those taxes are then divided into different areas. So there are environmental taxes in the sector of energy, for transport, for pollution, and use of natural resources, like water. So what we did was simply that we tried to match these 4 sort of cost categories with the different cost categories in HBS. And then it's quite a simple exercise to just divide all the tax revenues. Divide the tax revenues to all households in HBS, depending on how much they consume in these different areas. So for example, in HBS, there is information on heating. So how much money do your households spend on heating your house? How much money do you spend on gasoline? So based on that information, you can get pretty accurate number on how much people pay in environmental tax. And then after that, we had the problem that we needed somehow to get this data into EU-SILT. And this is where things became a bit more complicated. So essentially what we did was that we used a multiple imputation procedure and univariate predictive mean matching up to 10 years neighbors. I will not go into the math here because I don't understand the math. I understand what we're doing, but the good thing is that, or the problem here was that I soon realized that we had to do this individually. We had to impute these environmental taxes into USIL individually for each, separately for each individual country in order to get the best prediction. So that's why it took such a long time to do this. But the good thing with these invitations is that you can always evaluate them to see whether it worked out well or not, whether we can trust the data. So this is simply the percentage difference in mean scores of observed and imputed environmental taxes in HBS and USIL. So it's not a complicated thing. It's basically from data, we just asked to get mean score of environmental taxes in the household budget survey, and then we do the same for the imputed taxes in the USIL, and then compare these two values. And in most cases, most countries, the error that we make is pretty small. So it is as large as it gets in Portugal and Sweden, and in Spain, where we have an error of around 5 percentage points. So either environmental taxes in HBS or in USIL is 5 percentage points above HBS. So from this, I would say that the imputations work pretty well. But usually when you do imputations and you want to make sure that they are accurate, you don't look at only mean values. So what we did was that we looked at the mean values of environmental taxes across the income distribution. And this is just the error we make. Okay. So this is the first decile, second decile up to the 10th decile. And you can easily see that the least accurate imputations are made in the first decile. I tried to figure out why, but the first decile is very, very problematic. The first and the last decile is always problematic in distribution. But I would say that the first decile is really problematic. There are a bunch of households in HBS who consume a lot, but for one odd reason or the other, they don't have any income. And stuff like that. So it sort of distorts the analysis. So we make an error here, but it's not really large on average for all these countries. It's only 2 percentage points, which I think we can live with that. The good thing is that the error is greatest in the first decile because it will probably not affect the analysis. Because people that are located down here in the income distribution, they will be poor no matter what. Even if there were no environmental taxes, so there were lots of environmental taxes, they would be poor anyway. So I would say that this error will not, I don't think that it will affect our analysis. So that's the good thing. This is more of a complicated table. It basically shows you, once again, you have the different deciles of the income distribution. The numbers here are simply the number of countries. So in the first decile, there are 2 countries for which the mean value of environmental taxes in HBS and USIL differ by less than 1 percentage point. There are 2 countries in the that differ by 3. So the reason why I wanted to show this was once again that most of the errors that we make are in this first income, which I again don't think will influence our results at all. And you can also see here that there are actually a few countries where the difference between observed and imputed environmental taxes differ by more than 10, even more than 20%. So for some countries, it was very difficult to do the imputation. But as a whole, I think the imputations work well. So now we have the imputed data in EU6. So now we can actually sort of run the analysis. But we still need to define the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is poor households. It's based on this contrafactual situation. What would the income distribution look like if there were no environmental taxes? These kinds of contrafactual analyses are very popular in income distribution surveys, studies when we want to analyze the impact of different transfers and benefits. Simply what we do is that we calculate the poverty rate, and then we take away a transfer from the income distribution, and then we recalculate the poverty rate to see if there is a difference. So obviously, every time I've done that with an economist in the room, I will always get a question about behavioral effects, which we don't consider. So here we do exactly the same, but we don't deduct an income component. What we do is that we add environmental taxes, pretending that those taxes were not there, so they should have more money in the pot. So basically what we do is that we define the dependent variable like this. So it's poor households that are above the poverty line in absence of any environmental tax. They receive a score of 1. Okay. All the other receive a score of 0. So basically what we count here are the number of households that actually are thrown into poverty by having to pay those environmental taxes. If those environmental taxes would not be there, they would not be imposed. That's the dependent variable.
Sorry, can I just ask about the poverty line?
Yeah.
The poverty line is before environmental taxes.
Yeah, so I had a discussion with my colleagues about that, how we should work with the poverty line. So what we decided to do was to do what we typically do in income distribution studies. So the poverty line are set according to the actual income distribution. Then we modify the income distribution. But the poverty line is always set in relation to the original distribution. And the main independent variable at the country level that we're interested in is, of course, the degree of income replacement and social assurance. And I'm not sure if you have, read all these articles by Bradshaw about child benefit packages and stuff like that. It's basically this data from the Spring database, basically collected in the same way as his child benefit packages. It's based on what we call modern family household strategies. So simply what we do is that we pre-construct a few households. Like you're a single person, 35 years old, you're a single person, have 2 kids, or you're a 2-parent family with 2 kids and the ages of those kids. And then we pretend that this person gets sick for half a year. Or this person gets unemployed for a year, or this person enters into retirement. And then we go into the legislation in each individual country, trying to figure out how much money will this person receive benefits. And then we put that as a percentage to the take-home pay that they would receive if they instead were worked. And then we get what we call the degree of income replacement. But the degree of income replacement basically varies between 0 and 100. If it's 0, you will receive nothing. If it's 100, you will basically receive exactly the same as you would have in net salary if you instead would be working. So that's our sort of indicator on degree of income. In this paper, it's simply the average degree of income replacement in sickness insurance, old age pensions, and unemployment insurance. So those three programs. If I remember correctly, I think in this case that we only used a single person model family. And the reason why we do that is for other model families, usually family policies kicks in. So it's not, in those cases, it's not really degree of income replacement only in unemployment or sickness insurance or pensions, or not pensions, but unemployment and sickness insurance, because it will also include child benefits. We didn't want that in this particular study.
But can I ask another clarification question? So you use the words insurance there.
Yeah,
that's quite crucial to your paper, really.
Yeah.
Do you, for example, for the UK, the social insurance is dead, pretty much for working age people. So do you actually include? Do you mean social assistance benefits as well, or not?
No.
Right.
So for the UK, I don't have the numbers with me here, but the degree of income replacement in the United Kingdom is incredibly low. It's much lower than here. I can't remember, but I think it's down to 20%. Typically, in the other countries, it's around 60 to 80%. But it was that low even before social insurance was there. Sure. But
given your paper's phrase in terms of welfare state ideas, there's social assistance and social insurance. Yeah, this is a particular take. Yeah. And I will come back to this thing about social assistance when I show you the results, but because I have some ideas for the future. And honestly, I'm personally a social assistance guy. When I started to do research, all the insurances were already taken by my colleagues. So I took social assistance. So now I'm claiming these insurances back. And leaving so that then they can take them back. Okay, so this is what we get. There is, at least in economics, there's been a discussion for these 2 decades about the regressiveness of environmental taxes. So this has been researched before, both on hypothetical data, but also on actual data. But what the economists haven't done is to analyze the extent to which this sort of regressiveness increased power grids. But this is not surprising. It's this is basically, we call it the tax load. So it's you can't see the lines. The lines are on the computer. You can see the lines. No, there are some. Can you see the green ones? Yeah, but there are lines here as well. It doesn't matter. Okay, so this is just a tax load, environmental tax load, we call it. It's very simple. It's just a for each household the environmental tax that they pay divided by the disposable income. So obviously you definitely can see here that as a share of disposable income, poor people pay much more tax. And this is not surprising. All of these, to my knowledge, all of these environmental taxes in all of these countries are just a flat rate, certain percentage of the costs for energy or gases. And if you have a flat rate tax like that on consumption, you will get a pattern that resembles this. So in this particular paper, the benchmark model
we set the poverty line at the 60% threshold, the EU at-risk threshold. And by understand this threshold, I think that threshold is located here somewhere. Basically where the action is. So based on that, I think that it is reasonable that it should have, that these environmental taxes should have at least some effect on the poverty risks. This is what we get. When I present a scatter plot like this for my students, I usually ask them, what's wrong with this picture? Obviously, what's wrong with this picture is obviously Portugal and Denmark. But even if I take away Portugal and Denmark, the positive correlation becomes less strong, but it's still there. So on this axis, the vertical axis, we basically have the share of individuals living in households that are pushed into poverty by environmental taxes. Basically, with daytime is variable. So you can see UK, for example, somewhere around here. So between 2 or 2.5% of the population are thrown into poverty in the UK because of the taxes on their consumption, according to our estimates. In Luxembourg, it's even below 0.5%. But that's basically what it shows here. On this axis, we simply have the environmental tax revenue. Exactly the same tax revenue data that we use to get environmental tax data in the HBS. So you can see that there is a positive correlation. So the only thing we wanted to show with this figure was simply that, well, the size of these environmental taxes seems to be linked to the risk of poverty or being thrown into poverty. So the question now that we want to address, which is sort of the key in the whole paper, is whether or not social insurance are able to modify this correlation. That's sort of the whole point. This is just a logistic regression, having two levels, households in nested in countries. At the individual level, we have many more variables in there, but I don't show it here. So at the country level, we have this degree of income replacement in social insurance, which has a negative coefficient. I have a confession to make here. I read someone's paper in European Sociological about
country effects, yes.
Country effects and stuff like that. And I tried to play around with bootstrapping. I didn't get it to work. I don't think you can bootstrap using New Zealand because I need to use the weights. And there are no bootstrapping weights. I just wanted to mention that. But I struggled with it for a couple of weeks. I thought I need to bootstrap this if I look at LC.
But are those are random effects models, or have you got country fixed effects in there? Or
no, this is also something I will come back to later on. But fortunately, at the moment, this is the most simple you can get. It's just a cross section. Because this is so annoying. If you go into Eurostat, the homepage of Eurostat, and you download aggregate data from the Household Budget Service, you actually see that they have been running these surveys all the way back to the late 1980s. When you want to get access to microdata as we need, they only have two ways. They're 2010, 2015. And in some of these analyses, we had to rely on 2010 data for a few countries and 2015 data for the rest of it. So we basically only have a cross section. So obviously we only talk about associations, not causation. Yeah. But this coefficient is negative, basically telling us that higher degrees of income replacement and social insurance seems to go together with a lower likelihood of being thrown out. Okay. We sort of give some empirical support to our first expectation. I've been struggling with this variable. It's basically, again, just the Eurostat, the tax revenue. And what I've been struggling with is whether I should control for that or not, country. To some extent, I think I should control for it at the country level because, of course, the more taxes, the higher the taxes are, the higher the likelihood is that a person will be thrown into poverty. So from that point of view, I think it's important to control for it. But I'm not 100% sure. And when I'm not 100% sure, I typically do both ways. So I include them and I exclude them, and I see if there is a difference in the results. And the results are almost exactly the same. But that's why this variable is here. Now, the interesting thing, is there a social gradient? Yes, there is. So the reference category here are households where the head has a tertiary educational degree. So we can see that for individuals living in a household where the head only has a primary degree, have a much higher likelihood of being thrown into poverty. Also, those who live in households where the head only has a secondary degree compared to those with a tertiary degree also have a higher likelihood of being thrown. So there seems to be a social gradient in relation to educational attainment. And then the question is that gradient reduced by social insurance? To analyze that, we simply run so-called cross-level interactions between income replacement at the macro level and educational attainment at the household micro level. These interactions are tricky to evaluate, especially if any of the effects are negative, especially I would say if the main effect is negative. So as we typically do, I plotted the predicted probabilities. So let's forget about primary education for now. Let's focus on difference between individuals living in households where the head has a secondary educational degree compared to those that have a tertiary education. On the horizontal level, we have the degree of income replacement and social insurance. So it basically shows you that if the degree of income replacement and social insurance is low, there is an evident social gradient in whether you are pushed into poverty. But as income replacement and social insurance goes up, this educational gradient disappears. At very high levels of income replacement, there is hardly any difference in the probability of being thrown into poverty in relation to secondary or tertiary. So to our mind, this sort of at least confirms a little bit that the degree of income replacement and social insurance not only affects the likelihood of a person ending up in poverty due to environmental taxes, but it also, social insurance also affects any social gradient in that relationship, which is linked to education. Now, we have the results for those with primary education compared to those with tertiary education. First thing you should know that this interaction is not statistically significant. If we want to be very hard on that, we would say that there is no association. But we can still predict the probabilities. And then we end up with this very confusing result, which is basically telling us that there is hardly a social gradient. And this social gradient, in any case, is not linked to social insurance. If anything, the difference between educational levels in terms of the probability of ending up in poverty is actually lower the lower degree of income replacement. So basically what we say here is that, well, first of all, it doesn't seem to be a relationship at all for those with primary education. And even if we look at what the moderating efforts of social insurance, it makes no sense. Then the question is, why do we get these results? Well, here I think we come into social assistance. At least when I look at the USILT data, and when you look into this group, which only has primary education or less in today's society, that's a very, very selective. And the group is not that big. In most likelihood, this is the group in society which have major problems to qualify contributor benefits, social insurance benefits, that we. So if we phrase it from that point of view, one could say actually, okay, well, this is reasonable. If those with primary education in today's society, if those people rarely get these social insurance benefits, then there should be no association. So that's something that we discussed towards the end, and basically just point forward and say that maybe we should do this using our data on social assistance as well, and focus in on these very selected group of those with only primary education. So that's one of the conclusions. Another one, I would say, we run a number of sensitivity analyses. I will not go into them, but we did one thing. We played around with the poverty threshold. So we also looked at 50 and 40% of median income. It doesn't affect the main effect of income replacement. So that the idea that income replacement affects the sort of the probability of anyone ending up in poverty are still there, irrespective of which poverty threshold we choose. But the social gradient is very much linked to the poverty threshold. So when we lower the poverty threshold from 60, as we do here, we get this very nice result, to 50 and 40%. This interaction between income replacement and educational attainment disappears. And once again, we can only speculate the reason for that. I think it, again, may have to do, there may be a similar type of explanation as the one with social system of those with primary education. Because what we do when we lower the poverty threshold, when we concentrate our analysis on further down the income distribution we go, the more vulnerable people are. So again, there will be this trade-off that if people end up down here in the income distribution, for example, when we use 40% of the poverty threshold, in most likelihood they do not qualify for social insurance because otherwise they wouldn't be in that. So again, it could be the case that we need to look into social assistance. So that is something that we're going to do next. So we're going to run these analyses using a bit more harsh poverty lines, 40-50, I'm going to focus in on the most vulnerable people in society, those with only primary education, yes, and see whether social assistance makes them. If not, I don't know what to do. Yeah, so that's basically. Yeah, that's basically the conclusion. So I already went through this. So I think this is stimulating, at least for me, because there seems to be, I think there seems to be a story to be made here. But I think the full story that we really want to make, we can only make if we bring in a little bit of political science here as well. Because the idea is that if the welfare state may protect people from adverse economic outcomes of environmental policy, it could be the case that people actually are more in favor of these types of climate mitigation. So that's the idea of the whole project, that we want to see if the welfare state and social policy somehow can help us to increase our climate policies. And this is just sort of the first part of the argument. So we need to bring in a little bit of political science to make it clear. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much. Put some questions to you. Okay.
Just very quickly, yeah. What seems to me the most study.
Yeah. Very good question. And honestly, it's not fully clear to me either. The problem here is that we are left with the documentation that Eurostat provided. It's the same as the OECD. So they basically have a classification of environmental taxes. And basically what they say is that I think we have it in the paper, I can't remember it exactly, but it's something like this. So any tax that are put there by governments for an environmental purpose, that's an environmental tax. But obviously that's a fuzzy argument, because we know that these taxes affect behavior of people, the consumption behavior. That's why we have the tax. But another reason why we also have the tax is to get some revenue to the state. And those both arguments can be there to different extent, depending on which environmental tax we look at, and it can differ across countries and all the time. But that is the definition that we are given from Eurostat. I'm not going to do it myself, but I'm trying to force my PhD students, as I refer to go through the OECD documentation, because in the OECD documentation, you can we call it the PINE database. Then you can actually go into each individual country and year and see the name of the tax. And you can do this for all the countries, but it's a major task to go through that and see if you need to reclassify something. So what we do here is that we just trust the Eurostat that they have probably thought this through, and we just follow their advice.
Great. Thank you. Eva, then Kitty online, and then Leah. Okay.
Thanks very much for the talk. It was really interesting. I have a couple of questions, if I may. So the first one is clarification. You said that the accuracy of the imputation of these taxes doesn't really matter much for the results. So I think that's what you said. If you could just elaborate on that, especially I think as you lower down the poverty threshold, surely that would matter. Or if you look at other poverty outcomes like poverty gap, that would make a difference. And then so you show that there is this relationship between higher carbon taxes, higher poverty, but I was wondering about your thoughts on this. So you could you could design a different type of carbon tax that is progressive, that, for example, is linked to people's wealth. So that relationship, I guess, it doesn't need to hold, and whether you think European countries should actually explore different design of carbon taxes so that poverty outcomes are not worsened. And finally, just a note, so you use model families. I think there is also value potentially to think about using tax benefit microsimulation like Euromod, which I think you probably know about, so where you can really model those replacement rates for the individual households. And I can tell you about some exciting developments in relation to that model where they are working on this. So maybe there's scope for collaboration. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good comments and questions. First, for the clarification, what I meant was just that the accuracy of the imputation is, if it is problematic anywhere, it is in the first decile. But the point is that since people in the first decile will be poor, at least at the 60% poverty threshold, irrespective of the environmental tax, it will not affect the results. I don't think it will affect the results even at 40%, because in the first decile you have very poor people. But this is also something that we need to look deeper into, further we go into this exercise of imputation, because that first decile, there is something fishy going on in HBS when it comes to the relationship between incomes and consumption levels, which I haven't really understood. And there is this problem also with HBS, like you have in most income distribution services. There's a lot of negative incomes and stuff like that. You can play around with these and try to adjust for that. But this had to go quite fast. So I basically just introduced what they do at the Luxembourg study. I need to figure out what's going on at that first decile. But honestly, I don't think it will affect the results here. Your second.
Carbon taxes and poverty.
Oh, yeah. No, that's interesting. And I actually have thought a little bit about that. And actually, there is an argument by John Rawls when he said that, if you're going to organize a just tax system, then according to him, we should get rid of all the taxes, only have VAT, but which is adjusted to levels of consumption. From a theoretical point of view, I think there are good arguments for doing that. But the problem with taxes is like social policy. It also needs to be practical. And people also, it's also important that it is transparent. So I think in reality, I think it's very difficult to do an environmental tax on the household level or VAT or whatever, which is not flat rate and the same for all. But obviously it could be done.
Income taxes are progressive, so why not also?
Yeah, I know. I don't know. I don't think there is a progressive VAT or environmental tax in any part of the world. But it is.
But it's not.
You're totally right. Or is there?
I'm not sure, but yeah, why not? I'm sure it could be
I
designed.
mean, the way this is solved is by using the revenues from the tax, right, to redistribute.
Yeah.
So then it makes it progressive, right? If everyone gets money back.
Yeah.
Third one, Eva wanted to send you her microchip.
Yeah. No, that's very good. Actually, we used to do the Swedish part of Euromod until they started to pay us less and less money. They would say, no, we do it when we get proper money again. So I'm not working with Euromod myself, but my students are doing that. So I think definitely that. But I also want to use her on it.
Good. Kitty, Suzanne, I'm behind you. Kenneth.
Hi, thanks very much. Really, really interesting. Just a couple of questions I have. One of the, picking up really on things people have already said. because the poverty line is binary, that it does seem rather important, because you're much more likely to be pushed into poverty if you're just sitting just below the poverty line, aren't you? And so obviously looking at the different poverty lines as you've done, and perhaps that poverty gap seems important, but that also made me think about the composition of poverty. So we know, for example, that pensioners often are much more likely to sit close to the poverty line. So if you had a high percentage of, if pensioner poverty was important in your country, it might be that people are more likely to be close. So I wondered if you had looked at different, or two questions from that really. Are you looking at different groups aside from educated, not educated household, but sort of child poverty, pensioner poverty, and so on. I had a second thing linked to that, but I've now forgotten what it is. But my second broad question was about the point about social insurance and the focus on social insurance, because as Stephen said, obviously that's certainly from a UK perspective, it's true that we have a very low replacement rate with social insurance. And oh yes, my other question, that's what my question was. Are you looking at, is social insurance just for working age people? And is the poverty rates overall, including everybody, including pensioners? But yeah, so we have in the UK a very low replacement rate for working age people, but actually until recent cuts, for households with children, we have a very, very high replacement rate once you include, tax credits and support for children. So is really, are you intending to sort of argue that social insurance, countries that have more social insurance as opposed to other sorts of welfare, do much better at this and at protecting people from the poverty caused by environmental taxes? Is that an explicitly part of what you're trying to say, or is it just that you haven't got around to looking at the other parts of the system yet? And that things, that might look different if you look at the broader welfare state.
Very, very good question. I don't really have an answer. I just know that when I played around with this, I also had parent leave benefits in there, child benefits. I also had social assistance, and I made a ground index. But then, it's honestly, I don't really know how much I would like to push the argument that it's only about social insurance, or whether, because it could also, the problem here is that the indicators that we use when we want to measure the welfare state, they usually go together. So I've shown that in my social assistance studies, that if you perform good in terms of social insurance, there's a good likelihood that your country also performs good in terms of housing benefits or in social assistance, stuff like that. So it could very well be the case that our income replacement variable actually picks up other aspects which are not directly linked to social insurance. So I don't know. I think I need to. It's a very good question, and obviously, as an author, I need to make up my mind about what argument I want to make. So, but I need to think about that. The first comment was
different groups of the population.
Oh yeah. No, we don't really do that much with it in this paper, except that we control for age and number of children in the household and stuff like that. But we don't make a point about it. I've done some other studies on single parents, so that's one group that I would like to look into. But in this paper, we want to make a more general point. Yeah, but very good comments. And when I talk about social gradient in terms of educational level, that's just one gradient. There are many gradients out there. So that potentially you could have this as well. And I totally agree with you that no matter where we put the poverty line, there will always be some people that are scattered around this line. And it's precisely those people that some of them will be forced into poverty. I think the power gap, we could certainly look at the power gap, but I think what I will try to do in the next version will be to do more within the next paper, rather to work with different power thresholds, basically. But then I also think that we need to bring in this issue of social assistance, and it becomes a bit more complicated, but I think it needs to be done.
Liam, please, Thomas, and then Adam and Lucinda.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting, not just like as an exercise of like economic analysis, for repercussions of this. I could talk all day about this things, right? So the first, and other people have said, so what the tipping is going, and I think it would be interesting. Particularly with this kind of cost right now. And so then digging into more heterogeneity, I wonder if it would be this heterogeneity. A lot of country very revenue was I think of this in the UK case where a lot of the issues in energy were in the same way in other countries. Really kind of out there kind of counterfactual analysis to go in terms of like rigorous equivalent revenue. So in terms of, but then some kind of transfer overcome some of the issues as well. But yeah, super interesting stuff.
All right, thank you. Very good comments, and I will take them all on board. And for this last thing, that's what one of the PhD students are working on, and trying to figure out. Because you can actually see, well, in many countries they just implement these environmental taxes, but typically, at least when countries do major overhaul of the tax system, they are thinking broader than just terms of shifting, raising a tax just 2% or something. It's a whole package. So she's looking a little bit into that. There's also another thing that I haven't talked about, and you haven't commented it. So maybe I hide it very good. This is just one side of the coin, so to speak. So what we look at here are the taxes on households. Then you have taxes on the industry.
I'm about to ask about that.
Okay. Yeah. And of course, from an economic point of view, I have presented my ideas for economists before, so they would say that, okay, yeah, but you need to include the industry here as well, because the industry will just pass those taxes over to consumers in terms of higher prices. And of course, that's true, but it's not necessarily totally straightforward, because they operate on a global market. So they probably can't pass over everything. But but this is also something that one of the PhDs are looking into, sort of, or both PhD students are looking to, one from a political science perspective, whether, you know, why do some governments choose to environmentally tax households rather than industry? So why do another country choose different stuff? But also from a distributional point of perspective, I think it's important to bring those.
I think very important, pretty much for Liam's point of view about heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Thomas, please, then Adam Lucen, and that'll see it through, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Come up from several.
Sure. I will never talk to you again.
So that's benefits.
That's positive.
A certain move in people's incomes, 8 or 9%, depending on where you are in the income distribution. And making a move and so on. Can you justify to me of looking at poverty rather than moves?
Exactly that comment have I raised a number of times for the previous for the colleagues in Antwerp. Why complicate this by talking about poverty when it can be standardized in distributions and such?
There you go.
And it goes back to Kenneth's, you know, so I totally agree with you, but it has one advantage. That's in terms of policy relevance at the European Union, because they are basically hooked up. So it makes it much easier to reach out there. But otherwise, I totally agree with you that we restrict the analysis quite extensively by introducing power. But it makes it much easier to, there's a policy relevance. And as you know, Sweden are still part of the EU.
I mean, like out of the one see anything else to say anymore.
Adam, please, do you have a mean comment?
No, they never have any mean comments for anybody. I was just thinking about taxes on sugar, petrol, but let's just say petrol tax because we're talking about environmental taxes. Then if it was the case that poor people were using petrol more than relatively well-off people, in order to discourage the use of petrol, you'd want this incentive to be particularly targeted towards those people. You might want to then claw it back so that they would know worse off through some kind of income redistribution program eventually. But the tax itself, you'd perhaps want it to be. Do you see what I'm saying? You might want to be much more tailored than that.
I think that's the whole point with having these taxes to steer behavior. But I think what we want, the fundamental argument I think that we want to make is again then position a little bit towards the European discussion. Because I'm also part of this, what's it called, European Social ESPN, and it's like this review thing that the European Commission does. And then every time something new comes up, like the pandemic, or the energy crisis and stuff like that, the European Commission starts to think about, okay, we need a new program, we need to fix this. And I think the argument we want to make in this paper, or at least we have talked about this in this broader project, is that, okay, but maybe we don't need to invent so many new things. Maybe we can fix this if we just, with the old policies, if we just do these old policies good, so to speak, if you understand what I mean. And it obviously goes back to this idea that the Swedish welfare state is the best in the world and stuff like that. But it goes back to this argument that one of the benefits of a universal welfare state is that we usually don't need to work with these ad hoc solutions all the time, because there is this general safety that takes care of pretty much a broad bunch of problems. Not everything, but a broad bunch of problems. So I think that's one of the arguments we want to make here. Not that the argument is not that much, we need to fix this environmental tax. Because as what we want to show in the paper is that, well, they have this distributive outcome, but that may not be so worrisome if there is a good welfare state.
Thanks. Lucinda, please.
Okay, so I'll try to keep it quick and maybe there's things to think about at the time rather than necessarily full answer, but it's a combination really of Liam's question and Kitty's questions. So what I was thinking of, and you were talking about being policy relevant. So policy relevant, who the impact is on, and of what taxes. So you could, it's quite conceivable that some tax forms of environmental tax would impact some groups more than others. So petrol taxes more the working age, probably, heating taxes more older people and disabled people as well. Well, it just discourages people from working maybe. But then yes, and you get some but then they use transport more. But wouldn't you be interested in seeing what the implications are for the different groups of the different taxes, which you could then compensate conceivably by changes to different parts of the social insurance system? So if heating taxes are affecting older people more, they can take more with the pensions. But if they're if you then say, well, actually, or we'll put the fuel tax, you've got three different levers there, and you're kind of aggregating it all together. When it seems to be policy relevant, you want to disentangle more.
No, you're perfectly right. And I should say that this paper didn't start this way. It started in that sense. So what I tried to do was say, okay, I tried to limit it to a social risk, which is identifiable, and to a program which is identifiable, which are matched. So I only work with individuals, unemployment benefits. And then I thought that, okay, but now the whole argument this becomes something very tiny related to unemployment benefit. And I wanted to make a bigger argument. But then I had to expand over. But I totally agree with you. So I'm not sure I will have the time to do it, but I certainly hope that it will be in those PhD theses that I hope so much.
And he told me that they're going to have to finish by March. We need leads too, so they're on the case.
No, not these ones. But I want to thank you all. I think this has been a marvelous seminar with very good seminar, many good comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.